Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my March wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of March. So before I get into the books I read in March, I'm going to do a quick goals check-in, which I have been doing in my wrap-up so far this year and have been finding quite useful. So in terms of my big 4 goals for the year, one of which is to finish reading all the books by Anthony Trollope. I did indeed read one book by Anthony Trollope, although it was a reread, but it was a reread that I definitely wanted to read this year, so that's fine. I also read 2 of my long-term TBR books, and I'm hoping to read all of by the end of the year. I'm also aiming to read more internationally and more in translation in 2025, and this month I read works from the UK, China, India, Ireland, and one book by an author who is Danish but living in the US. Although that book was about a British author, so I feel like that's not very international in my reading. But anyway, and one of the books I read this month was in translation. So let me get into the books, and I will start off, as I often do, with some classics. The oldest book I read in March was this. This is The Story of the Stone, Volume 2 by Cao Sui Chin. This is a Chinese classic from the mid-18th century, and this is the second volume of it. So this is a very, very long novel, The Story of the Stone, also sometimes known as The Dream of the Red Chamber. I read the first volume probably about 18 months ago, and I read the second volume in March. I've got the third volume on my shelves, and I need to get my hands on volume 4 and 5 at some point. So I really enjoyed this. I'm probably not going to say too much about the plot because obviously it carries on from volume 1, but basically this novel looks at the kind of life and fortunes of a particular upper class family in 18th century China. We're looking at kind of all of the members of this family, cousins and relations, and also all the servants who work in this very big complex household. And we're kind of chiefly focusing on Bao Yu, one of the young sons of the household. In this book, he's in his kind of late teens, I would say. And the subtitle of this, volume 2, is The Crab Flower Club. And in it, the sort of young people of the household create this poetry club, which they call the Crab Flower Club. And then they spend a lot of time writing poetry. So not very much happens in this novel, but I did enjoy the reading experience a lot. It's very, very readable. Like, it's quite a long book. It's about 600 pages, but I did find it very, very readable, and I got through it quite fast when I was reading it. The translation is very good. It's by David Hawes. I would say that it's one of those books where I find it historically fascinating more than loving the story and all the characters. But kind of the social history present within this book is really, really interesting. The social and cultural history. I studied a bit of Chinese history and a bit of 18th century social Chinese history at university, and I find the window this book gives into a particular point in time to be very, very interesting. I find quite a lot of the characterization quite interesting too, and there are definitely some interesting elements, but I wouldn't say it's a favourite, but I am keen to keep reading. And it was good to read the second volume and to be reminded how easy the writing style is, and how it flows, and how, although it's quite long, it's not dense, because that does make me think that I will definitely make sure I pick up volume 3 this year as well and try and get the next 2 volumes in the series too, because I would like to finish it, and I did really enjoy it a lot. So there we go, that's The Story of the Stone of volume 2. Then I also read 2 works of Victorian literature in March, both of which were rereads. So one of them was my Anthony Trollope pick for the month, which was He Knew He Was Right. I didn't actually read the physical copy, listened to the audiobook narrated by Nigel Patterson, I think, which was very, very good. So He Knew He Was Right is a really, really wonderful novel by Anthony Trollope, a real favourite of mine. I had read this before, but not since I was a teenager, and it was really nice to revisit it and remember all the things that I think are amazing about this book. I have done an individual separate review of this book, which I think is up already. So He Knew He Was Right is a story of various characters. It's quite a long book, so there's lots of different subplots, and I love it when Victorian literature does that. But the kind of central plot is about a married couple, Louis and Emily Trevelyan, and what happens when the husband becomes increasingly jealous about his wife's friendship with another man, and we watch how this causes their marriage to fall apart, and a lot of the book is about the kind of breakdown of their marriage. and therefore explores like Victorian marriage, gender roles, custody battles, and all that kind of stuff in a really, really interesting way. And meanwhile, there are also lots of other subplots going on, and I love some of the subplots in He Knew He Was Right. There are some wonderful, wonderful characters, some wonderful love stories, some wonderful like family stories. Miss Stanbury is just like one of my favourite characters. I love her very, very much. And there's so much going on in He Knew He Was Right that I just absolutely love. I had such a great time reading it. Love listening to the audiobook. And there were just so many fantastic moments. I think it's such a great book. I will leave my review link down below where I spoke about it for like a good 20 minutes, which I won't do here. But yes, I love it a lot. One of my absolute favourite Anthony Trollops. And it's a standalone as well, which not all of his are, so you can begin here or, you know, read it without having read any of his others. Although there is one passing reference to Barsetshire, not in a spoiler way at all, but that just like really made me smile, because I had forgotten that because I hadn't read the Barsetshire Chronicles when I first read this, so that was fun. Then the other Victorian book I reread in March was Wuthering Heights. I reread this for the Bronte Readathon being hosted by Emily from Novell Novels. I'll leave her channel link down below. And actually, He Knew He Was Right fit one of those prompts as well, because one of the main characters was called Emily. So it was really nice to reread Wuthering Heights. Again, I didn't actually read this physical edition. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Patricia Routledge, which is a really good audiobook, one I definitely recommend. And I think Wuthering Heights is a really fun one to listen to on audiobook, because obviously like part of the premise and structure of Wuthering Heights is that it is a story within a story and someone is telling a story to someone else. So if you don't know about Wuthering Heights, it is a revenge story much more than it is a love story. It is a dark, brutal, fascinating, complex Victorian work. Came out in 1847 but set in the late 18th century and the very early 19th century, following two generations of some very troubled families. So we begin with a man called Mr. Lockwood, who arrives at Wuthering Heights, meets his new landlord Mr. Heathcliff, and then asks his housekeeper more about Heathcliff, and Nellie Dean tells him the story of Heathcliff's life, and it's so good. It's so good. It's one of my favourite books of all time, like top 5. Probably the book I've reread the most, though maybe Pride and Prejudice is beating it now. And I just love Wuthering Heights. Every time I read it, I spot new and different things, and every time I read it, I'm just like, oh, what a masterpiece. What an absolute masterpiece. Another classic I read in March was a short Indian classic from 1905, and that was Sultana's Dream by Ruqayyah Sakhawat Hussain. So this is probably even more a short story than a novella. Like, it is very short, but I've read it on ebook, so it's a bit harder to judge the length. But I heard about this through a podcast called She Wrote Too, which I'll leave linked down below. And I thought it sounded really interesting, so I thought I would give it a read, and it was very interesting. So it is a feminist utopian novel from 1905, in which the main character, Sultana, goes to sleep, has a dream, and in her dream she is woken by someone who says, "Come, I'm going to show you my world of Ladyland where women are in charge." And then she takes her around the world, and they talk about how life would be different if women were in charge rather than men. And there's also quite a lot of like interesting science fiction elements, and like most things are solar powered, and there's quite a lot of interesting discussion about like solar and water power and how they have arranged their world. And there is a lot of criticism in it, obviously, of patriarchy, and I really enjoyed this one. It's a very, very interesting read, for the feminist elements and also for the science fiction elements. Like, I was obviously expecting lots of feminist elements because I knew the premise, but actually the science stuff was really, really interesting too. It is quite like a simple, straightforward story. There isn't much of a plot. It's mostly just Sultana's new friend telling her about her world. And it kind of reminded me a bit of, you know, books like News from Nowhere by William Morris, which is a kind of Victorian socialist utopian novel where a character wakes up in another world and then the person takes him all around this new world, and everything is kind of quite simplistic, and, you know, not very much happens, but it's quite kind of interesting from a ideas perspective. And I think especially, you know, this is written in 1905, and kind of looking at the ideas and thinking about how radical this would have been at the time is really, really interesting, and I really liked it a lot. So I enjoyed reading that, and it's very, very short. It will take you less than an hour to read. So yeah, I will leave a link down below, the podcast where I heard about this, and also where you can find the text online. And then I also read 3 works by Agatha Christie in March. So me and my husband Nick have been listening to lots of Poirot lately. We are working our way through the Hercule Poirot novels in publication order. We had already listened to a couple that were around this place in Agatha Christie's work, so I don't think these 3 are actually technically sequential, but they are all quite near each other. So we listened to Appointment with Death from 1938, Sad Cypress from 1940, and Evil Under the Sun from 1941. So let's start off with Appointment with Death. In Appointment with Death, Poirot is sort of relatively backstage until the second half, but in the first half we're following a doctor called Sarah. She's traveling abroad and she meets this American family who seem very, very toxic. There is a older woman, the kind of matriarch of the family, her stepchildren and her daughter, and they're all kind of in thrall to their stepmother, their mother, and she doesn't treat them very well. And Sarah takes a kind of interest in this family, and then the matriarch of the family ends up dead. All of her family kind of had a reason to kill her. What actually happened? Poirot steps in. I really liked Appointment with Death. I thought the characterization was really good, and the kind of like psychology was quite interesting. And I guessed the solution, which I don't usually in Agatha Christie, and I like fully guessed it, like not just the correct murderer, but like the motive and the means as well, which I almost never get, so I felt very proud of myself. But yeah, really enjoyed that one overall. Not as much as I enjoyed Sad Cypress, which was probably my favourite of the 3 we've just read. Sad Cypress begins in a courtroom, and we know that the main character has been accused of murdering another young woman. All the evidence points towards her. She had motive, but did she do it? And then we kind of flash back and see the events of what happened from her perspective, and we also follow Poirot in the present day trying to find out more information and see whether or not she was really guilty. So there was a lot that I really liked about Sad Cypress. I thought it had a very, very interesting characterization, really good pacing and plot, and like I guessed the solution like 15 minutes before it was revealed, which I feel like is the most satisfying thing, when you like get it just in time, so it still feels like a really big twist, but also you feel very clever. I really liked all the courtroom scenes. I thought those worked really well, and yeah, overall Sad Cypress was really great. Like that would definitely be one of my favourite Poirots so far. And then we also listened to Evil Under the Sun, where Poirot is on holiday in England, in a tidal island. There are various people staying at the hotel. Poirot's kind of got to know all of them, and then one of them ends up dead, and he is trying to work out who might have killed her. There was a lot I really liked about Evil Under the Sun. I thought the characterization was really, really good, as it always is with Agatha Christie. She's just a master of characterization. I do feel like there were a few like loose ends or like things I wanted to be delved into a little bit more at the very end of the book, but in general I thought it was a strong Poirot. Not as good as Sad Cypress, definitely that was my favourite of the 3, but I still really enjoyed it, and I do just love listening to Agatha Christie on audiobook. Then moving from classics to contemporary literature, one book that I read at the end of March and absolutely loved was The Favourite by Fran Littlewood. This was so good. So this is a proof copy. It comes out in June. The publishers kindly sent me a copy. I read Fran Littlewood's debut novel, Amazing Grace Adams, when it came out. Well, before it came out, actually, quite a bit before it came out, and absolutely loved it. We're published by the same publisher, and we did an event together back in 2022, I guess. And I read Amazing Grace Adams before that event, and just, it absolutely blew me away. And so I knew I was going to love The Favourite, but like, I think I might love it even more than Amazing Grace Adams. It was so good. So The Favourite is a contemporary novel, a kind of family drama. And we begin with a big family who are all away on holiday together, 3 grown-up sisters and their parents, the sisters' kids and partners. They're on holiday, they're in a forest, and the 3 sisters are standing together to have their photograph taken. And while they are standing there together to have their photograph taken, a tree snaps in the wind and looks like it's about to fall over onto the sisters. And it ends up that they're all okay, no one gets hurt, but in the seconds where it looks like a tree is going to fall on them, their dad runs forward and saves one of them. And so everything kind of goes on from there, and we see how this one event brings out all of the tensions within this family, all of the complexities within this family. starts dredging up a lot of incidences from the past that they've kind of pushed under the carpet, and it's so good. Like, it's both so tense and so dramatic. Like, the drama level is very high, but also it's so funny and it's so moving and it's so good. Like, I cried and I laughed and I just had such a wonderful, wonderful time with it. I just thought this book was so good. I have a favourite sister. My favourite sister is Nancy. I loved Nancy. She was great. But all of the characters in here felt so real and complex and was so well done, and everything was just great. And also they're on holiday in this house they've rented that is all made of glass, and that just like really added to that tension, the idea that they can't escape from each other in this weird glass house where everything is a bit surreal. And it was just great. It was just so good. So yes, I would highly recommend The Favourite. It's coming out in June. It's fantastic. Go out and buy it. It's so good. And then I read a bunch of historical fiction, as I always do. So here we have Nettle Black by Nat Reeve, which I finally read. This has been on my TBR for so long, and I'm so glad that I read it this month. It was such an utter delight. So I thought this book was going to be quite like gothic and spooky from the cover, but no. This is like super Victorian, queer, cozy joy, and I had such a great time with it. So this book is set in the 1890s, and it's about Henry. Henry is a young heiress and is expected to make a good match with a suitable gentleman, but Henry really doesn't want to do that, so Henry runs away, and then Henry ends up getting involved in the all-female detective agency that exists in the local town. And then she meets and develops a massive crush on one of the division sergeants, and also tries to solve some mysteries going on in the town. And there are some like darker elements. You know, there is a crime plot with the detective agency, but like it's mostly very cozy and like completely delightful. So yeah, I really recommend this if you like historical fiction set in the Victorian period, especially if you enjoy sort of queer Victorian stories and Victorian stories that kind of challenge gender norms and things like that. Like, I just had such a great time with this book, and yes, I would really recommend it. So clever, so fun. Then I also read The Shadow Key by Susan Stokes Chapman, which was my Patreon historical fiction book club pick for March, and I really enjoyed this one. It's set in 18th century Wales, and we're following a doctor called Henry who comes to Wales. He's from London, never been to Wales before, doesn't speak Welsh, but he has taken on a position as village doctor because he is kind of in disgrace. Something has clearly gone wrong in his career in London, and he arrives here to be the village doctor, and no one seems to want him here. The villagers aren't very welcoming. The man who employed him seems a bit standoffish, but he kind of strikes up a friendship with Lynette, who is a local landowner. She tolerates his presence, teaches him more about Wales, and they get to know each other more. And they together end up kind of investigating the death of the previous doctor, who died in slightly mysterious circumstances. And everything kind of goes on from there. There was so much I loved in The Shadow Key. It's very gothic, very atmospheric. Really enjoyed the writing style. The two main characters, Lynette and Henry, were so well done. And I really enjoyed their like dynamic and their relationship and kind of how they get to know more about each other over the course of the book, and their kind of very different perspectives on life. I thought worked really well. I also really loved all the like medical history stuff in here, and some of the stuff about what Henry is doing as a doctor were just great. Like, some of the most tense scenes were like scenes around medicine, and I thought that worked very well. And I also really liked the look at 18th century Wales and kind of looking at how like language and class were so bound up together in Wales at this point in time, you know, with the upper classes speaking English and the villagers speaking Welsh, and I feel like there was a lot that was looked at that was very interesting here. And I also thought the twists and turns of the plot worked really well. So I really enjoyed The Shadow Key, and would definitely recommend that one. And yes, I'm excited to go and read more by Susan Stokes Chapman. I think her first book, Pandora, is meant to be great as well, so I definitely have to get my hands on that one at some point. Then I also read two novels that are on the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. I am going to do a separate video reviewing these two, maybe with another book. If I finish one fairly early on in April, I will see. So I won't talk about them for too long here, but I did read two in March. So the first one that I read was The Mare by Angered Hampshire, which is a very interesting historical novel, very powerful, quite a tough read, but like worth your time as well. So The Mare is a historical novel based on a true story, and based on a real historical figure, a woman who was a Nazi concentration camp guard, and after the Second World War she ended up marrying an American and moving to America. And he didn't know about her past. He didn't know what she'd done during the war until a journalist approached her about it. And she later ended up going on trial for what she had done in the war. And this novel is told in two perspectives in alternating chapters. So every other chapter is from the perspective of Hermione, following her from the mid-1930s to the end of the Second World War, and looking at how she ended up working in the concentration camp, what led her to that point, and also kind of looking at her indoctrination and like how swept up in everything she was. And then in the alternating chapters, we're following her husband Russell from the moment that they meet up until the end of their lives, really, looking at how they met and fell in love, how he kind of deals with learning what she did during the war and why he stands by her. And it's a really, really interesting novel, very, very powerful. Some of it is obviously like quite brutal, and the descriptions of things happening in the concentration camps and like some of the things that Hermione does are really horrific. But I think the book is written in such a way that it is still very readable, and it's not just like appallingly impossible to read. The chapters are all very, very short, and because we switch between Russell and Hermione, I think that really helped with making it digestible and helping you to be able to read it. I also read the book quite slowly, like on my phone, a few chapters at a time, which I think was also quite a good way to read the book. I'm going to read you, there's an epigraph to the book, which I think is very, very interesting and useful in terms of like explaining the premise of the novel. And the epigraph is from a book called Modernity and the Holocaust, and this is what the epigraph is. The most frightening news brought about by the Holocaust and by what we learned of its perpetrators was not the likelihood that this could be done to us, but the idea that we could do it. And I think a lot of the book is about that. It's about the horror of someone who, from Russell's perspective, you know, the husband, is ordinary. How did she do these evil things? Is she to blame for these things that she did, or was the state to blame? How much responsibility does she bear? And I think the way this book looks at how indoctrination works and how governments and systems can dehumanize people to the extent that people who would never consider themselves to be bad people can do terrible things. And I think the way this book looks at that is very complicated and uncomfortable, but is also important and interesting. I thought it was great. I will talk about it more in my Walter Scott Prize review, but I really would recommend it a lot. And then the other book that I read in March for the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction was this. This is The Heart and Winter by Kevin Barry. So this novel is set in the 1890s in Montana, and we're following a young man called Tom Roke, who had a bit of a tough time in life, doesn't have much money, drinks a lot, takes a lot of drugs, and he meets and falls in love with a young woman called Polly, who has just recently got married to another man. They end up kind of running away together, and we end up with various characters kind of on their trail as they kind of make their way through this winter landscape. So in some ways it's a Western, but it's like a really, really literary Western. And I would say that this wasn't necessarily my cup of tea in terms of the writing style. Like, it's very literary. The writing style is quite like, dreamlike is the wrong way of describing it. But I found the writing style quite difficult to follow. There were so many instances where I had to read a paragraph like 3 times before I understood the point. And I do feel that this novel would have been improved by having a lot more punctuation, but, you know, I think that's a personal taste thing. This book has a very exciting dramatic plot and a lot happens, but I did find that for me, the writing style probably got in the way of the plot a little bit because it's not really my cup of tea. Having said that, I feel like I struggled with this book for quite a lot of it, but I did think the ending was fantastic, and I feel like the ending worked very well for me and kind of helped with a lot of what had gone before, or kind of like tied it all together. You know, it's quite a short book. Maybe if I had read it in like one sitting, I would have got more out of it, but I did find it quite like a hard book to get into because of the writing style. So yes, I liked a lot of things about The Heart and Winter. I do think it's a good book. I think if you are more of a fan of literary fiction than me, then you might really love this, but it is probably my least favourite that I've read from the long list so far. Then finally, the last thing that I read in March was a work of non-fiction, and that was Charles Dickens' The Stories of His Life by Jesper Sorensen. So this was a work of non-fiction about Charles Dickens, and it's kind of a mix of biography and literary criticism, which I really enjoyed. I thought that structure works really, really well. So basically the book is structured like by his novels in publication order, and then Sorensen kind of writes about like what Charles Dickens was doing in his life at this time, what events kind of may have influenced this book, but also like how his career was going. And so although we get quite a lot about Dickens's like personal life, we also get a lot about like his career trajectory, which I really, really enjoyed and found fascinating. And I think it gives you a pretty decent overview of Charles Dickens's life, as well as talking really critically, interestingly about some of his books. And I do always find it really interesting whenever I read Dickens' literary criticism, because his books are like often really long and detailed and complex and layered, and there's so much to be said. And so like seeing what different critics pull out of different books and what they focus on, and how that might be different to like what I find the most interesting thing in that book, like that's actually a really interesting element of reading literary criticism about Dickens, which I really enjoyed. So overall, I did really enjoy Charles Dickens' stories of his life. I thought it was really, really interesting. The one thing I will say is that I thought some of the language used around Barnaby Rudge and other characters with intellectual disabilities was like quite outdated. I don't think it was intended maliciously. I think the author is Danish but living in the US, and obviously I live in the UK, and like I think different words have different connotations and different contexts in different places, and it's possible that some of the words used are like considered much more offensive in the UK than they are in the US, but I still was a bit surprised at some of the language used. In general, I did think it was a really interesting work of literary criticism, but like that is worth being aware of going into the book. So those are the books that I read in March. Not a bad reading month overall. I didn't get through everything on my March TBR, but I knew I wouldn't. I never do, and that's fine. And now we're moving into April, and I have many exciting books that I'm hoping to get to this month, so we will see how I go. So that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know down in the comments what you read in March. What was your favourite book of the month? Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Otherwise, I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.